back with you, and we're ready to do the break-in on this truck, or at least start the break-in process. I wanted to go over a few things. I did install my Futaba radio system, so that's all hooked up, working good. The servos are still stock, but I did manage to fit a Reedy 2700 receiver pack in here, a LiPo receiver pack in this battery box. And it actually fit perfectly in there. It fits really good, height-wise, length-wise, width-wise, everything. I highly recommend that. I'll get a part number and attach it below right here. That way you guys have that. Fits in here perfect. And then of course the receivers are basically all the same size, so no worries there. But anyway, that's all set. I got it, like I said, I mentioned, all set up with my Futaba. And that's all working great. The steering servo on this rubber mat, you know, it's like, it does pretty good. It's better than I thought it was going to be for a stock servo. One thing I will mention, even with the stock radio, make sure you set your endpoints. Set the steering trim by eye, you know, just kind of by eyeballing, just make sure the wheels are centered for the steering. And then also set your endpoints right and left. You want to set your endpoints so that right as the steering knuckle touches the steering stop, that should be the end of your endpoint adjustment. If you go anything past that and the servo is trying to fight past that point, it's going to fry the servo over time. You want to make sure those endpoints are set just enough throw to the right and just enough throw to the left also. Same thing with your throttle. The throttle is almost even more important. You want to make sure that at wide open throttle, it's just opening the carburetor just enough. Okay, and then same thing for braking. You want to make sure that as you're hitting the brake, the servo isn't trying to go past that. It's not trying to go, you know, like it's not trying to bend the servo arm to try to apply more brake, because you're only going to get so much brake on these anyway. And I got my garage open here because we're going to be starting this up, so sorry for any traffic noise that you may hear going by. But again, endpoints are super critical for throttle and steering. Make sure you get those set correctly. Also make sure your steering trim is set, and then your throttle trim is set. You want to make sure that when you turn your radio system on, you look down the carburetor bore and you make sure the slide on the carburetor is being held open. You want to make sure that's going all the way closed. That way when you fire this thing up, it's not just going to take away on you. Don't forget to remove the foam out of the air filter. Obviously, you're going to need to remove that to check your endpoints and adjustment anyway, but don't forget to remove that. As mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and use this stock air filter, at least for break-in. So I'm going to go ahead and slap that on there. And I'm not going to put any zip ties on it yet until I start driving it. You know, a lot of times for break-in, you've got the air filter on and off anyhow. So just wanted to mention that as far as the radio system goes. Next thing, I want to cover just a few items that you should have right at your disposal when you start the break-in process. You shouldn't even think about putting fuel in the tank before you have these things ready to go. First thing is going to be after-run oil. You actually want to put some after-run oil in it first things first. Before you even get started, before you ever even think about pulling that pull start, you want to go ahead and drop about 5 to 7 drops of oil down the carburetor. And that's going to prevent any premature engine wear the first time you pull that cord. And when you drop it in the carburetor, you may have to open the slide just so it actually goes down in the engine. So that oil is going to run down into the crankcase. It's going to mix in with your front and rear bearings. And also the first time you pull the cord, it's going to get mixed in up in the cylinder also. So right away, we've got lubrication in this engine before there ever even gets fuel to the carburetor. That's important. And also, obviously, when you're done running the engine, if you're going to store the truck for like more than a day without firing the engine back up, put some after-run oil in it. That's going to prevent any condensation from building up, and it's going to keep the inside of this engine really happy for a long time to come. After-run oil is really important. I make my own. It's a 50-50 mixture of WD-40 and Marvel Mystery Oil. It's cheap and it lasts a long time. A little bottle of Marvel and a can of WD-40, this stuff will last you forever. And it's great stuff. Even when I'm building engines, I use it as pre-lube. When I'm reassembling engines and stuff, it works great. So after-run oil will be the first thing that you need to have handy. Second thing, obviously, is a screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver. There's no doubt you're going to need to make some adjustments depending on what altitude you're at, sea level or above sea level. Like I'm at here, I'm at about 5,000 feet above sea level. The carb is most likely set for sea level, so you're going to need to make some adjustments, whether it be to the high end, the low end, or the idle stop screw, just to get this thing running. I actually haven't looked on this carburetor yet. Yeah, it is a 2-needle carburetor. So you've got a high end here and a low end here, and then your idle stop screw is going to be over here on this side. There's no doubt you're going to need this just to get this thing idling right away. So screwdriver. Obviously, a glow starter. That's for obvious reasons. You need to ignite the glow plug. Make sure you have a good quality charged glow starter handy. A good break-in fuel. I wouldn't go dumping like 30% nitro with 8% oil in this thing right off the bat. In other words, I wouldn't be going to pour any Tessman blends or World blends or whatever in this tank to break the engine in. And that goes for almost any engine. Even my race engines, I always break them in on a higher oil content fuel. So this is actually VP. It's their Master Basher. It's a 20% nitro, and I believe it's got 14% oil, which is more than enough to do a good break-in on any nitro engine. And oil's the critical thing. Lubrication is necessary in these little two-strokes, so make sure you've got a good fuel. And fresh fuel too. If it's fuel that's been sitting around on the garage floor for a year, toss it, get yourself some new fuel. Next is a temperature gun, an infrared temp gun. This is going to be important because it's going to tell you the temperature of the engine. And during break-in, maintaining a good temperature on the engine is critical. On the first few heat cycles, which I'll go over here in a second, keeping the engine up to temperature is the most critical thing, because when you're just idling, especially if it's a colder day like it is here today, you need to make sure this engine is staying up at operating temp, because heat cycles are the key thing to breaking in these engines. Moving on to that, or touching on more on that topic, is you either want a heat gun or a cylinder head heater. I use this for racing, so that's what I'm going to use today. It's a lot more handy than a heat gun. But anyway, either a heat gun or a cylinder head heater. If you're using a heat gun, before you start the engine, you just want to hover the heat gun over the cylinder head. You want to get the crankcase on both sides. You want to get this engine up as close to operating temp as you can with the heat gun before you ever even try to start it. You don't want to try to start a cold nitro engine. These things are all aluminum as far as the crankcase goes and the cylinder head goes. And depending on what construction, whether you're ABC or ABN, aluminum brass nickel or aluminum brass chrome on the cylinder and sleeve, either way, you want to make sure this engine is warm before you even try to start it. You want to make sure that metal's expanded, and it's going to be a lot easier to turn over. So I use the cylinder head heater. I'll keep this on the engine the whole time. I'll put it on the engine, let it bring itself up to temperature, and then get it running, and then I'll leave it on the engine and keep a battery plugged into it, and I'll constantly be monitoring the temperature of the engine. Today we're only like 45 degrees outside Fahrenheit, so it's critical that this that you do something either with a cylinder head heater or a temp gun to keep the engine up at all time, the temperature of the engine up at all times. And to power that, I'm using a 3-cell LiPo. This is a battery I use in my crawlers. It's a 3-cell 2200, the same battery I use when I'm racing to keep my race engines warm. And obviously your radio. If you're just idling, you can pretty much do it with the radio system off. You're just gonna let the truck sit there. But it may be handy to have your radio to kind of blip the throttle to help get it started. So I always keep the radio system handy, although I don't always use it for break-in. Now going back on my break-in method, and this is the method I use on all my nitro engines. The key on these, I'm breaking in a nitro engine, the key to longevity is heat cycles. Okay, I've been running these nitro engines for over 20 years. I have a lot of experience with them, and I can honestly say I've never melted one down. I've never had one fail prematurely. I've always just kept really good care of them, and it all starts with a good break-in process. Okay. Basically, what I do for break-in, the process that I use is the heat cycle process. So in other words, you're going to be bringing the engine all the way up to temp and then letting it cool all the way back down to ambient temperature before repeating the next cycle. And the first 4 tanks of fuel, 4 tanks, are idle only. I will only idle this engine for the full tank and then shut it down, let it cool down. So basically I'll bring the engine all the way up to operating temp, let it idle a full tank, shut it down, and then let it cool all the way back down to idle, or to operating or to ambient temperature. Got distractions out here. So warm it up, idle it, shut it back down while you're monitoring the temperature the whole time. You for sure want it above 170 degrees. You don't really want it more than 200 degrees, but that's kind of the sweet spot, 170 to 200. As long as the engine maintains a temperature in that range the whole time while it's idling, you're gonna get really good results. And then again, let it cool all the way back down before you repeat the next cycle. 4 tanks. After the 4th tank, I'll start driving it, but not hard. I'll start kind of doing figure eights, half throttle type stuff at first. Really quarter to half throttle, only short bursts of half throttle. And then on the 6th tank, I'll kind of start doing short bursts of full throttle. And then on that 7th tank, that's kind of when I'll start leaning it out a little bit, because you do want it rich the whole time. You don't want to tune this thing for racing right away. You want it rich and sluggish and boggy because you want as much fuel and lubrication through this engine as I mentioned. And then after that 7th tank and again you're heat cycling it after every tank, you shut it down, let it cool all the way back down before you reheat it, fire it back up. After that 7th tank, you're pretty much ready to tune it and just drive it at that point. You can switch to a higher content nitro fuel. You can switch to a little bit lower oil content fuel at that point. But for a ready to run engine like this, I wouldn't recommend going less than like 10% on your oil content. It's not a race engine. It's not really meant for those 8%, 7% lean oil mixtures that we run in the race fuel with 30% nitro. A ready to run engine like this, I would really keep it right around 20-25% nitro with, like I said, north of at least 10% oil content. But for the life of this engine, most likely I'm going to stick with the 20% nitro and the 14% oil content. I think that's going to really produce some long life out of this engine, and it's going to run fine. It's going to run great. So that's the process I use. Heat cycles are critical. And the reason heat cycles are critical is really just the nature of how these engines work. So these engines don't have piston rings, so their compression relies on a press fit, basically. So the cylinders of these nitro engines are actually slightly concave. So as opposed to a regular nitro engine that has parallel cylinder walls, a regular engine for that matter, has parallel cylinder walls, these nitro engines have tapered cylinders. Okay, so the walls aren't parallel, they're slightly tapered at the top, and that's what we call the pinch. Okay, that top tapered section up here of the cylinder is where we get our pinch or our compression. So when the piston comes up, it's in that pinch, that tighter area of the cylinder, and that's where we get all our compression from. And when these are brand new, that pinch is really, really tight, okay? So doing heat cycles on this engine, allowing it to rev up or wear in slowly, is going to allow that pinch area to wear to the piston a lot better. If you fire one of these up brand new on the first tank and just start ripping it, you're going to break a connecting rod. You're going to fry the engine for sure, because that pinch is so tight. The connecting rod's actually going to have so much strain on it. It's going to stretch, it's going to wear, and you're going to ruin the engine right away. So you need to make sure it's a slow process of getting that piston seated into the pinch area of the cylinder. And that's really the key to success on one of these nitro engines is a good break-in process. And avoiding high revs for a long time. I see guys rev these things up on like a stand or something trying to tune them, and they'll like revving them to 39,000 RPM, just screaming, and that's not what you want to do. That's how you're going to stretch a rod and break it and do damage. Tune it while you're driving it. Never tune these things on the stand, only tune it while you're driving it. But anyway, getting a little bit ahead of myself there. I'll explain the process as we go, but for now is the exciting part. Now we're going to put fuel in the tank for the first time. We're going to warm up the head, and we're going to fire this thing up and let it idle. So let's do it. As I mentioned, first thing I'm going to do is slap my cylinder heater on. This is a ProTech heater. You can get these from A-Main. They work awesome. Just slides over top of the cylinder head right here. Velcro's on, and these suckers get hot. Don't kid yourself. These things get really hot. Once it's on the engine, plug in your battery, and then we're going to hit the little white button on the heater. Light turns on, that means it's heating. And this circuit board has a LiPo low cell voltage built into it. So this thing will shut off when it sees the voltage get to a certain point on your LiPos. It's not going to drain your LiPos all the way down and ruin them. So you can trust these. For this process, again, just have probably more than one of these laying around. If you're going to keep the heater on the head the whole time, you probably want like 2 or 3 of these batteries fully charged sitting by your side ready to go. I'm going to grab a couple more right now while this thing heats up. But if you're using a heat gun right now, I would just be using the heat gun to blow warm air all over this engine, both sides of the crankcase, the head, to get it up to operating temp. So while this thing comes up to temp, I'm going to grab some more batteries, and then we'll be back to put fuel in the tank, fire it up. All right, so I went ahead and grabbed a couple more batteries. So I'm set to go on keeping the engine up to temp while it's running. I also grabbed a towel, which is something I forgot to mention. If you're going to run it on your bench, obviously there's going to be a lot of oil and stuff that kicks out of the exhaust pipe. So it'll be nice just to kind of keep that there and wipe up any stuff that gets on your bench or on the concrete or wherever you're doing this. And I also did grab my heat gun. As I mentioned, it's kind of like a little chilly here today. It's about 45 degrees and I've got my garage open. So I am going to use my heat gun in conjunction with the cylinder head heater, which is already really warm, just to help heat the crankcase up, because otherwise I'm just relying on time to, time for the heat to transfer from the aluminum cylinder head to the aluminum block. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to warm these up with a heat gun. Don't use a hair dryer, it's not going to get hot enough. Use a heat gun on low and just kind of go around both sides of it. All right, so I've got some pretty good heat scrubbed into the engine. I'm going to check it with my gun. So you can see I'm 120 on the engine block, which is great. That's perfect. And I always check both sides, and that's good. These engine heaters have a cool little glow plug hole in the top, so you can get your glow plug in there and also your heat gun. And we're also 120 on the cylinder head. So that's a perfect temperature to fire it up at, especially given my ambient temperature here right now. So now's the exciting part. Let's get some purple drink in the fuel tank. First fuel up ever on the Nitro Kyosho USA-1 Nitro Crusher. All right, once your tank is full, before you even put a glow igniter on it, we want to prime the fuel system. 2 ways you can do that. One is you can take the air filter off and hold your finger over the carburetor bore and pull the pull start a couple times. That will vacuum fuel from the tank into the carburetor. Or the method that I normally use is I just plug my finger over the exhaust, which when you pull the pull starter is going to pressurize the exhaust tank through the muffler. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to hold my finger over the exhaust and watch for the fuel to go through the fuel line and into the carburetor. Once it reaches the carburetor, I'm going to pull the rope probably 2 more times just to ensure we've got fuel in the crankcase. There we go. So I saw the fuel go to the carburetor. I know for sure we've got fuel in the carburetor and in the engine. And you can see how tight, or I don't know if you could see or hear, but that pull starter is pretty tight. This is a fresh engine. So again, it's critical that we've got oil in it already, and it's critical that we've got fuel primed in it before we can put the glow starter on the engine. But now, got it primed, we're ready to fire this thing up and let it idle. So it's right there. So that was the end of the first tank. You never ever want to run the tank all the way empty, especially on break-in, because all that's doing is starving the engine of oil and lubrication, and it's running lean. You definitely don't want to do that on break-in. So always, to shut it off, just shut it off a little bit shy with just a tiny little bit left in the tank, and shut it off by putting your finger over the exhaust until the engine shuts down. Once the engine's shut down, you want to take the pull starter and you want to rotate the engine out of the pinch. So as we talked with that tapered cylinder, we want the piston at the bottom of it. We don't want the piston to cool while it's in that pinch area. So you want to rotate very slowly, pull the pull starter until you feel the piston go past the top of compression and then down into the bottom of the stroke where it's nice and loose and free. That's where you want the piston to be every single time you shut this engine off, whether it's during break-in or even just during normal operation after it's broken in. So the truck ran that entire time. It idled a full tank. It took it about almost 30 minutes to idle that tank. And you can see this rag that I placed here, all that oil that's on that rag. That's exactly what you want to see. You want to see all that oil going through this engine because that's what's helping break in this piston and cylinder. So now the engine's on a cool down cycle, and you'll notice when I was temping the engine, I was giving two different temperatures. One on the side of the engine block, which is always going to be a little bit cooler. Normally that's going to be 120 to 135 degrees in that range. And then I was also temping the top of the engine, which I was able to keep at about 180 degrees the whole time. I ended up removing the cylinder head heater about 10 minutes into the idle because it was actually getting about 205 degrees and kind of creeping up slowly. And I didn't want it to get that hot during break-in. I like to keep it right around 200, 170 at the lowest, but within that 30-degree range. And so I pulled the heater off of the head, and with the heater off, it was staying right at about 183, 185 degrees, which is perfect on the cylinder head, and about 130-degree range on the crankcase, which is also perfect. Also during that idle cycle, I did turn the idle screw back out a half a turn because as the engine warmed up and it got all that after-run oil burnt out, the idle started to creep up just a little bit, so I went ahead and backed that idle screw out just a little bit. But I never had to touch the high-end mixture or the low-end mixture screw. Car going by. Typically for break-in, you don't want to mess with the factory needle settings. You want it running really rich the whole time. So again, it's idled the first tank, letting it cool back down. I've got the piston out of the pinch area, which is the perfect thing for break-in. So I'm going to let it finish cooling the whole way. I'm going to complete the other 3 tanks of idle break-in, and then once I'm ready to start driving it around on that 5th tank of fuel, I'll bring you back and we'll go from there.